Hello, everyone. Welcome. As per usual, well, I see the glowing halo around this wonderful sci-fi concept art of a sci-fi girl who kind of looks like she's wearing headphones. I think it's kind of cool, but it's probably not. She's probably on the radio or something. But let me go ahead and take this banner down. I'll be on the camera in just a second. Just need to make sure everything looks great and take the banner off. 1 second here. All right. So the music that you had heard, as the banner does say, is my sci-fi ambient track, which I don't have it as an album yet. I will put it on as a track, separate track for album, but I just have it posted on my channel. The recent video for concentration and creativity, and it's an hour long, and it's much better quality than what StreamYard can provide. So let me take that down and let me see if everything looks good before I get on camera here. Looks like we've got a lot of people. This is nice, nice. Audio is good. Awesome. Yeah, Gigawatt, I see you. Actually, Prof and I were just talking about you, like sometimes we like remember comments that people say, and like, yeah, Gigawatt, he hasn't been around. So good. Awesome. All right, let us put the camera on. I like this avatar. It looks great, but so you'll have to see a real person now. Okay, so hopefully everything is looking and sounding good. Seems fine on my part. I don't have YouTube up as per usual. I don't have YouTube up, so we are just within the sphere of StreamYard. Let's go ahead and welcome the chat, and then this will probably, depending on how it goes, this will probably be more or less a writing rant, and I will give you full how would I call it? I guess it's disclosure. You do not need to read the book Hyperion to listen to me. This will be a book review, and besides one major thing, I will not spoil it. I probably will spoil one major thing because it would be, if I was listening to the video and I was listening to this review, it would be the one thing to persuade me never to have read this book. But we will talk about fair things. We're going to be talking about the good and the bad. Just unfortunately, the bad has outweighed the good as far as Dan Simmons classic. But we'll get into all of that after I welcome the chat. We've got Ghost Planet Max Inc. 1.0. Welcome. You say you never heard of the story. I know, I've been hearing that around, and I'm kind of surprised. But just before I go on, Hyperion is pretty much a classic as far as sci-fi literature. It's pretty much up there in terms of fame as far as Asimov's Foundation series. Maybe not on the level of fame as Dune, but pretty much there. If you're serious about science fiction literature, like from the 30s all the way leading up to the 90s and the early aughts, chances are you've come across this title. It's pretty famous. And I will give the reasons why. I know why people think it's a classic. That there are reasons why it's a classic, but there are a lot of reasons why I personally don't think it's a good book. But let's continue down. We've got channel member Daniel Heron, just got out of the bestest John Williams concert ever. Got to get to the airport now. Well, that's good because I'm so glad it's a good concert. I can't wait to see a stream on this or some commentary you have going forward, because I'm happy when you're happy when you see a good show. And I feel sad when you don't see a good show. You are very honest in your opinions, which is great because it's your channel and people come to your channel for your opinions. As people come to my channels I might sound opinionated on this stream, but we'll see. But good. I am happy that it sounds like it exceeded expectations. So that's good. Well, happy traveling back to hot, sticky Alabama. It's really hot and sticky here. It's probably hot and sticky everywhere except the Northwest. We've got my wonderful prof says, something tells me we might get a sound engraver rant. Looking forward to it. Yeah, you're probably gonna get some opinions. That's fair, right? We also have Brian Gilmartin. Welcome. Music sounds good. Okay. I thought it sounded a little loud, but that's good. Big Al Presents says, me thinks she didn't like the book. It's kind of true. Kind of true. Private Eye says, hello, and also D. Pensac, and also Andreas Hernandez. And that's, oh, and Dwayne Asher. Good. Welcome, all you guys. Good. So a lot of people, so some people I've been seeing here in the chat, but then also I've been seeing just floating around. I guess someone responded to me on one of my shorts, on Hyperion, saying I hadn't heard of this book. So let's actually just talk about that just for a second. This is very interesting. This book was published, I think, 1989, 88 or 89. So it was getting into the 90s. And I've known about this book for a number of years. And I saw it on shelves, whether it's in the library or at a home, a friend of mine or something, like some college student liking science fiction, and it's guaranteed to be on the shelf. So I've been aware of this book by Dan Simmons for a very long time. And I knew it was a series. I didn't know it was a 4-part series. Actually, I think it's constructed more like 2 duologies back to back. And we're going to be talking about structure. We're going to be talking about a lot of stuff that even if you haven't read this book, this expands beyond science fiction. This really is a writing stream. This is a writing stream based on a very frustrated reader. So it's not exclusive to Hyperion, but we are going into the details of why I did not esteem this that favorably. So very interesting. Maybe people, I don't know how young people are, give or take, on this YouTube chat, but maybe people born after 2000 or maybe even 1995. Maybe they haven't heard about it. Maybe Hyperion isn't as famous as it used to be, but it was, I mean, at least for a long time, at least for a good 25 years, it was something that floated around just as frequently as Frank Herbert's Dune. So it's not on the fame levels of Dune per se, but I would probably, as far as fame, I would probably put it up there, even with Asimov. So anyway, that's yes. Oh yes. Let's just say this. He can always watch the replay. I hope he does. My wonderful prof has to go for a second. He has to record a mini lecture for his class, so he'll be right back. He's something I can. He can do something I can't, and that's record really quickly and then be done with it. We'll get into the story for a second, but I tried to make this a fixed video. I recorded, I think, Friday night, about an hour's worth, just little snippets, and all of it sounded just awful. Like all of it, I was tired. My critique of it sounded bloated and unstructured. And I was telling the prof, like, the last thing I want is a recording of a review of this book that sounds bloated and structured, because the book is bloated and structured. So I'd get flack for that already. So anyway, I think this stream is going to be more or less a 2-parter. The first thing I do want to concentrate on the book itself. The first book that this review is only Hyperion. This is not the whole series. This is not even the duology of the sequel to the first book. This is just Hyperion, the first book of the series and duology. And I think I lost my train of thought. But oh yeah, I want this stream to be like a 2-parter because I want to talk about Hyperion, but then I also want to talk about like booktubers in general, because I did, after finishing the book last week, I did kind of look at different reviews and kind of told me some stuff about booktubers. So that's what they call themselves, I think. So I do want to talk about book reviews on YouTube in general, if we get to that point. Okay, so Gigawatt says he's an 80s kid, still never heard of Hyperion. This is interesting. Okay, well, maybe I won't get so much flack then, because a lot of people, if you presented to me 10,000 readers of Hyperion, chances are 7,000 to 8,000 of those would absolutely give it 5 out of 5 stars, glowing praise, and all of that. So let's begin after a swig of water, because it's going to be a doozy. So Hyperion is considered a sci-fi classic, published in the 1980s, as I had just said. So getting into the 1990s, we I think he finished the entire series. The author is Dan Simmons, and it's it's a classic for reasons I do understand, and I'll get into those. So we're going to start first with the good aspect. There's a lot of good things involving the book. So because of these specific things, I understand, okay, maybe a serious sci-fi reader would consider reading this book. So I'm gonna tell you the good stuff that would make it uh, reasonable to think why it is a classic. So the f- the first good thing, really the only good thing, no, a couple good things. The first thing is actually the world building. Well, actually, let me backtrack for a second. My rating for this book is 1.5 out of 5 stars, and I would give it the 1.5 for the world building. So in terms of world building, there as far as sci-fi world building, it's Asimov levels of potential. There's a lot of good stuff to be had with world building. You've got ideas, very, very interesting sci-fi ideas of the effects of space travel and even time travel. Because if you go, the human race, um, while I think this is 700 or 800 years after our present time, if I have that correctly, and even though society and the human race is very technologically advanced, they have not acquired the technology of instantaneous travel. So even if you've inhabited different worlds and different planets, at the very least, you're still working with traveling from one planet to the next. And because of the strenuous nature of space travel, you are in, is it cryogenic sleep? Is that the term? I'm missing the term right now. But you're in stasis, of course, so your body can stay rejuvenated for all those years of travel. But so if you're called to have a job, for instance, on another planet, you might, as far as your body is concerned, under this stasis, you might have only lived a year in terms of regeneration or replenishment, but maybe your family back at home has covered 20 years of their lives. Maybe you have relatives who are no longer living. So there is this risk and weight about space travel. It does give you a sense of time and lost time and extended time, as far as extending your life through this kind of sleep stasis. And so that's an interesting thing. And another very interesting thing is that there's this uneasy alliance between the human race under this uh, galactic governmental form called the hegemony. So the human race, the hegemony, has this very uneasy, iffy reliance on and alliance with this technocore. And the technocore is basically a conglomeration of sentient AI. Now, the reason why it's unsteady is that you have different factions of AI. You've got, I don't know all the names of the factions, but just to give you a tease, you've got the stables, which is AI. They're more or less neutral about the human race, or they're maybe even benevolent about toward the human race. Then you've got the volatiles, who would prefer the extinction of mankind. And then you've got, I forget this third faction, but basically they're either way as long as the human race isn't in their way to basically obtain their ultimate goal, whatever the ultimate goal is. So the Technocore, at least in one aspect of the book, has imparted this instantaneous time travel called farcasting. So basically, you have little portals where you can go from one planet to someone else's office on another planet without feeling the effects of time lost. And there are concepts like time debt, which I wasn't really quite sure of, so I'm not really gonna explain that. But the human race, even though they've accepted this technology of the Technocore, they're still not quite sure. There's a little bit of animosity between the sentient AI and the human race. And Then we've got a personal threat for these backwater worlds that is a modified human race. So maybe it's a hybrid of the AI and the human race, but they're called the ousters. And so you could kind of think of like maybe very tall, very formidable, ousters. We don't see them though. We don't see them in the book. So you've got all these really unstable factions, maybe going against, maybe there are factions within the hegemony of the human race, maybe there are factions going against each other with, like, there's maybe war within the technocore of the sentient AI. And then you've got these ousters who are just hyper strong. They have superhuman strength, and they're pretty much, I don't know if it was a matter of exile or something like that, but they're not really welcomed among the people of the hegemony. So there's a lot of warring factions. And in terms of the worlds themselves and the landscapes and the technology, it's really good. Like I saw a lot of really neat worlds reading this book. That a lot of things that really just it's very what's the word, enticing. It really entices the imagination. And so I would say, to Dan Simmons' credit, he is good with world building. There's no denying. He has very, very good ideas about the galactic setting and the scope and all of that. However, and I hate this. I hate saying this. This is where it gets a little rough. Interesting ideas, poorly executed. And I will make the comparison with Asimov's galaxy. Asimov has a similar galactic scope, a huge scale of different worlds and governmental factions and all of that. Although he has the robot series, so he has it's a different context of AI and robotics and mechanics and stuff like that. So very different from, possibly, I haven't read the robot series, but different way of viewing robots and machines and stuff like that than Dan Simmons with his Technicore. But in the narrative of Asimov, I could comprehend what was what. It's like, oh, this is interesting. Maybe there were some things I had to look up, but on the whole, I knew what things were about. With Dan Simmons' Hyperion universe, as cool as it is, as very high up there as far as potential as it is, I actually had to look at other sources. I had to look at commentary. I had to look at articles, people who really knew, maybe have read and reread his works over and over and over again, who had a better understanding, who could comprehend the world so much better than I with the first book, because that was my one time reading the book. He just does not make it clear. He sort of makes it, obviously there's something going on between the Technicore and the hegemony, but he doesn't really make it clear in the text to what scale. Possibly because the book itself is really, really long, full of just so much information. And then you already have just a central plot anyway, not really involving the Technicore. It's, you'll I guess apparently you see something more things, more revelations involving the AI in the second book that I'm just not going to bother to read. So to make the comparison, Asimov with his galactic scale, I could digest so much better and read and comprehend so much better because his text was succinct, it was clear, and anything that I wasn't sure of, I could maybe look outside the text. But with Dan Simmons, it was a plethora of very interesting concepts that I didn't comprehend at all because the text and the narrative itself was so sorely bloated. Now we're going to get into why I would give it the 1.5 out of 5 stars. So we talked about the 1.5 out of 5. So where are the other stars? So my reason for rating this book so low, and again, I'm going to be clear, I'm only going to be talking about the first book. This has nothing to do with the series. This is standalone first book. That's it. So people who have read the series might think it's very unfair for me to say, well, you need to read the second book to understand it better. I'm like, no, because there's a very specific reason why Dan Simmons, at least with his sci-fi, has lost my trust. So, what are these reasons? Why did I personally mark this book down so low? It has to do with a few things. I would say three things in particular: structure, pacing, and characters. Now, characters is probably the minimal damage I would say that the book suffered. But let's talk about structure and pacing. They're kind of two separate things, but they do go hand in hand. And we'll talk about structure first. And the structure really involves the ending, which really disappointed me. I had never been so mad at the ending of a book before. So maybe I'm sure people had, a similar experience if they didn't prefer it. But we'll get to the ending a little bit. But let's talk about structure. So the structure of Hyperion is a very unique structure, and I think that's why people praise the book a lot. And the way it works is we have a prologue established with a central figure, and he is one of 7 people selected, personally selected by the cult of the Shrike. This really terrifying, enigmatic figure, which, and actually, the Strike is an A plus concept. He's every time he or it, I probably should say it. Every time the Shrike appears, it was A plus. Very, very terrifying figure. So if you want to read Hyperion just for the Shrike by itself, that's probably the reason to do that. But anyway, the central figure called the Consul, he is one of 7 figures selected by the religion of the Shrike and the hegemony to set out on this pilgrimage to this very mysterious backwater world called Hyperion, and more in particular, I would say this very unusual area of the time tombs. Now, the time tombs are fascinating. I actually, the time tombs were kind of one of my favorite parts of the story. The concept. It's this anti-entropic, kind of age-defying, time-defying place where people going in or emerging out, depending on the context, are traveling or are experiencing time jumps. So it's pretty fascinating. So Hyperion has this really unique, interesting mystique about it. And so this pilgrimage of 7 people, each have been selected because each has a tale that involves either the Shrike directly or at least indirectly, where people can learn more about these time tombs. Now, the pilgrimage, it even says on the preface, the pilgrimage of these 7 people, their mission, their end goal is to encounter the Shrike to pretty much either solve or at the very least, even fatally end a personal dilemma. They need a revelation of some kind that they believe, based on legend, the Shrike can provide. Now, they're all going to see the Shrike at a very personal risk, because this is a brutal entity who really evades time and dimensional space for different reasons that are more or less covered in the sequel and then the subsequent stories, which I'm not going to read. So I sort of read on, like, those geek Wikipedia. I didn't want to read the book, so I just okay, let me look into this character a little bit more. But anyway, I as far as the first book is concerned, everyone has a very upsetting past or dilemma involving the Shrike, and they want personal closure. And it's implied that this pilgrimage is pretty much going to set the course of events for pretty much an all-out apocalyptic war between humanity and the Technicore, maybe involving the Ousters, whatever the case is. But okay, it's a pilgrimage of 7 people, so you would expect it to be a little bit more on the intimate side instead of more the galactic side. So how this structure works is that we've got the prologue involving the first member of the pilgrimage, the consul. And it's implied that there's already a traitor in the midst. So even at the end of the prologue, people are thinking, oh, the reader's expecting, oh, there's going to be a traitor within the pilgrimage. And then into the first chapter, we're seeing this setup, and it's a really nice setup involving this kind of space traveling tree ship. It's pretty cool. But everyone's basically eating dinner. They eat dinner a lot when they're traveling, and they're eating breakfast and they're drinking wine and stuff like that on their travels. Um, that's an aside. I mean, if you're gonna write characters, like, okay, maybe have them eat once in a while, but like not so frequently. Anyway, so by the time everyone meets each other, like they're at this table, at this dinner, everyone's meeting each other, and everyone reluctantly agrees upon telling their tale of their reasoning, the reasons behind going and embarking on this pilgrimage. And so what happens is, after that first part of the first chapter, after being in the present, each person picks up a number saying, oh, this is the order I'm going to tell my tale. So the priest of the bunch, he tells his tale first. Then we have the soldier. So the priest, the soldier, the poet, the scholar, the detective, and the consul. Now that's I think that's six. There are seven members, but for events that take place in the middle of the book, one person is bereft from telling their tale. So, okay, that's pretty interesting. So they're each telling their tale. What happens is the priest tells his tale, and then we're in the present again. And then the soldier tells his tale, and then we're in the present again. And then the poet, and then the present, and then on and on and on. And a lot of people really did like that structure. A lot of people thought that was great. It paced the story so well. And this is kind of where we're going to get into structure and pacing. There were a couple, like two of the stories, these short stories, are very well written. And I don't want to kind of jump the gun. I want this to be a structured review, but we'll get into the tales a little bit later. How's that? So we've got the tale, then the present time, another tale, and the present time. What was really slowing my experience down were a couple of things. The first thing was every tale, even the couple of really good ones, um, they were too long. They were way too long. This is kind of getting into the pacing, but we'll stick with structure as well. Uh, every tale was at the very minimum 50 pages, but I think every tale was more than 50 pages. If I can guess correctly, based on memory, I think every tale was 70 pages or longer. Now, even with maybe the scholar's tale was a little bit shorter, but even with some very good gems of stories, it was a very long, arduous process. There were a lot of descriptions. I liked descriptions of worlds, don't get me wrong, sci-fi or fantasy, but it was very long-winded at times. And it kind of maybe Dan Simmons had this metaphysical effect on me or whatever. Maybe that was his intention. But when you're going through a tale, even if it's good, it's very long. It's like time stretched. It's like taffy. Like you're just kind of slogging through. I'm like, okay, this is interesting, but where is it going finally? Like I'm getting something. Can you get me to that place faster? So it's very long. And then at the end of the tale, it's like a sucker punch. Like some of these stuff are really mind bending, and I was like, whoa. And I thought, okay, that was more or less, besides the Scholar's Tale, which was my favorite, that was more or less the format of every single story involved. It was excruciatingly long, and then it hit you like a sucker punch. And so my mind, I was expecting that formula, and I wasn't too off with that. I was it was a pretty safe guess that that was how it was going to be. So the pacing of it was really bad, at least in my book. Besides one 1 to 1.5 tales, 1 to 2 tales, the pacing was really, really off. So I didn't like that. Like, when I saw that happen with the first tale, which I really enjoyed, it's a horror short story, basically. It's terrifying, and it was really good, it gripped me. Whew. But it was still long-winded, you know? But when I saw that that was going to be the pacing, I was expecting as much for the next tale, and I was a little disappointed. I was like, "You know what? So every tale was probably 60 pages. I could 50 pages. I'm gonna be fair. I think that's a little low, but every tale was about 50 pages. There were some that really could have been between 20 and 30 pages, and that would have been fine. So between that and then the present moment was also a little long-winded. Things were happening to the characters as they were traveling, but kind of in a superficial way. And they weren't reacting to the tales like I was reacting to the tales, especially the 2 tales that really gripped me. Once they finished the tale, they were done with dinner, and then they would go to sleep or something, or they would stand watch or something, or maybe they would go to a bar and think about their itinerary or whatever. So the present moment between, the tale and the next tale, it wasn't long, but it didn't feel right because I'm like, "Okay, I'm needing to see the reaction of these people because this is happening in their world. So why am I being just like there are some really terrifying moments where I'm like, wow, this is really sticking with me. This is really resonating with me. But then it's kind of just glazed over, like superficially glazed over among the characters. And we'll get into the characters a little bit later, but the pacing between the tales and then the present moment was a little bit off. Now, if I had been given the task maybe to edit this body of work, or even come up with a similar structure myself for my own story, I would have had it done this way. It wouldn't be everyone's preference, and I understand, but I think it would make it a lot more concise. I would have had the tales as its own separate anthology of short stories. Kinda like, I forgive me, I really don't know the Canterbury Tales, but that's actually what this book is based off as far as structure is concerned. And, according to Prof, there is a conclusion. So there's the tales between the pilgrims, and then there's kind of a conclusion and a destination. We'll talk about the conclusion for Hyperion, which is atrocious. But anyway, so with the, uh the tales, I would have comprised them as an anthology of short stories. This is not a novel. This is not a novel thing for the science fiction world because at that point, when Dan Simmons was writing this stuff, there were just probably libraries by that point of magazines and compilations. I say compile. I don't know why I say it. Compilations of short fiction. So the average sci-fi reader of the time this was published was more or less used to reading short fiction in a string of of works just all together. So I would have had that. I would have preferred that at the start. Maybe that would be part one of Hyperion, and then you're in the present moment with characters reacting and conversing and integrating all the elements of all the tales. The tales themselves needed to be way shorter. I think Simmons could have hacked at least 20 to 25 pages to 30 pages of every tale. Maybe the Scholar's Tale was pretty good. Scholar's Tale was great, actually. Um, but all the other tales, I actually didn't bother reading the last tale because I was too tired. It's too long winded. So part one, how I would have preferred is part one, anthology of tales, little tales, and then part two being the present moment of all the pilgrims interacting with one another and traveling toward their final destination to encounter the Shrike. That would have been a lot more coherent in my reading experience, but instead things were drawn out way too long, and it was very off-putting to go from the past to the present when the characters themselves were not reacting the way a reader of their fiction, was reacting. I'm not saying they had to react exactly like I I had reacted, but it was like, why do I feel like I'm more personally and emotionally invested in a couple of these figures than the pilgrims themselves? That was frustrating. So I guess that's kind of getting into the character aspect. So the structure, therefore, was really off, and that included the pacing. Pacing was just absolutely a D minus for me. Now, lastly, on structure, and this is where I really hated the book. I really felt like Dan Simmons didn't care what happened to his own characters, or if he did, he wanted to wait until book two so you would be on a cliffhanger and get book two. But because I felt like Dan Simmons didn't respect my time as a reader of his novel, I'm like, listen, I'll go read, the synopsis of it, but I'm not going to read the next book. So I end up not purchasing the next book. But what happens is even the preface by itself of the book, like you see the book cover, like my thumbnail's the actual book cover, the Shrike overlooking the ship going through the glade of grass. It's kind of this ocean of grass that has like the grass blades really do sear you, so they can't travel by grass. But anyway, uh, the book preface itself on the book says this pilgrimage has to have a final conclusion. In so many words, I don't know the exact words, but the so okay, I'm reading these tales. I'm reading through these tales. I'm going through the different reactions, and then they're traveling to the time tombs to encounter the Shrike. And then by the last tale, and then by the last interaction with these characters, I started seeing well, actually, I was starting to be suspicious like 200 pages before the end. But basically, I was thinking, is Dan Simmons not going to provide enough room for the conclusion? And then I started thinking, I don't have a lot of pages left before I'm done with this book. Is he just going to leave it hanging? And that's what it was. So I was expecting, okay, we've got the tales, we've got the information, we've got the motives for the characters doing what they're doing to get to this end goal. And then what happens is they're on their way to the time tombs in a very flamboyant, stupid, ludicrous way. I'll get to that in a second. They're on their way to the time tombs. You could see the tombs. They've got a hill to go and a valley to cross and stuff, and you could see the tombs, and then it ends. So in the present moment, they didn't encounter the Shrike. That's for book two. And I thought, okay, this is 480 pages. I would have endured 100 more pages if I got the conclusion for that book. And people sometimes I heard people praise the cliffhanger. Well, I don't think they liked the cliffhanger, but they appreciated the cliffhanger because like, no, Simmons wanted you to get the second book of the duology. In fact, some reviewers were defending Simmons, saying Simmons intended to sell it as a two-parter, but because it was so massive, the publisher said, no, you need to sell it as two separate books. Where does that sound familiar, you guys? Tolkien. Tolkien originally wanted to sell all of Lord of the Rings as one big book. And the publisher said no, because of the cost of paper, we need to divide it into three books. He did not want it divided into three books. He wanted it divided into three parts. But or maybe he didn't even want that. Maybe he, through some strict editorial work and maneuvering, it ended up being three books for the trilogy. But he is different from Dan Simmons here with Hyperion, because the Fellowship, even though it continues to the Two Towers, it's still a complete book. You have closure. You have the fighting with the Uruk-hai and the Death of Boromir. Actually, Death of Boromir is at the beginning of the second book. But you have the Fellowship is broken. You have your parties now. Like, okay, we're going to do this here, with Aragorn. We're going to do this with Frodo and Sam. We know Frodo and Sam are going to go, and we'll see them in the second book. But there is still a conclusion to the Fellowship, even though the story is going to go on. And it's a nice bittersweet conclusion. The fellowship has broken. That's it. That I think that's the title chapter or whatever. With Hyperion, what happens is, first of all, this is a very devastating embarkment. They know that if they encounter this very terrifying creature, the Shrike, that could impale them through the Shrike is able to through the tree of pain. He's the Lord of Pain, and the tree of pain. He can actually impale the person upon this tree and not have them die, meaning they could be in torment and agony of being impaled upon for forever. I think it does end up becoming like a simulation, like a really, I think it is a uber immersive simulation. So it's actually not like a spiritual thing. I think it's more of a technological thing, but it's still terrifying. So people understand that he can brutally kill. This is a very, very serious, terrifying encounter if the pilgrimage goes to the time tombs to encounter them. What happens, and I'm sorry, I'm going to spoil it because it is so bad. So just hold your ears or mute my video for the next minute or so. I'm going to say exactly what the ending is, because had I known, I want to have read the book. What happens is the pilgrims, they've told their tales, and then they go into this valley, and you see the time tombs, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I only have 4 or 5 more pages left of this book. What's going to happen? What happens is the scholar, he has for reasons we will see, he has a newborn child with him on the whole journey, or a baby, an infant child he has on the whole journey, and he's kind of cooing, and she's crying, and he's trying to have her sleep, as they're going to this devastating area, and he's singing a song. By the way, keep this in mind, this is like 700 to 800 years in the future, in our future. Okay, we're looking at what is it, 2700, 2800, so way out into the future, right? And they're first all in single file, not talking, very somber. And then one of the characters asks the scholar, "What are you humming?" And then he said, "Oh, it's this song." And the song is, "We're off to see the wizard, the wonderful Wizard of Oz." Okay, so that's ludicrous. First of all, this is you're referencing something that people today in our present time hardly reference. Like the Wizard of Oz maybe will stay intact in the cultural sphere for another 700 years, but maybe not. That's a long time for it to hold up in terms of fame. So why are these people in the year 2800 referencing a song, from a film in the 1920s and 30s? That's weird. What made it even weirder, people started humming the song with the scholar, and the single file down to the time tombs, they start walking abreast and skipping with gaiety and stuff and singing the song. And for a moment, for a very unchristian moment, I wanted to flip the book off. I didn't. I withheld because that would have been a sin, but I was so mad. It's like, this doesn't make sense. Isn't that a terrible ending? What you guys leave your comments in the chat, like if that's a terrible ending, but it was so ludicrous. It was flamboyant. It was the gaiety of it. And I mean the weird, quirky happiness of it. I'm not talking about the social stuff, how we use that word now, but it was so bad. I was like, well, at least go to the time tombs morose and very sad and not knowing what's going to happen. But maybe Dan Simmons explains why they sang The Wizard of Oz going down to the time tombs. But it was messed up because the whole story has tragedy, has graphic violence, has utter despair, has isolation and loneliness, and then that's the ending. And so people might say, well, you'll get it. It's gonna be great. It's gonna be the good book. The next book. Just read the next book. I'm like, no. No, Dan Simmons, as far as sci-fi, I can't speak for his horror stuff. He absolutely betrayed my trust, especially with that ending. That was 470 pages leading up to that point. And if the story continues, fine, but do it like The Fellowship, where it's like, okay, there's a really good closure, and then we're going to move on to the next book. And maybe, had it been written well, maybe I would have continued reading it. But I was already getting a little bogged down with the structure and the pacing. A couple more things, and then I'll get into the chat. One thing involving structure as well. You see presented in the prologue that there's a spy in the middle of this pilgrimage. And that's fine. That's an interesting setup. But because I went through 450 pages of a lot of information and some of it was really long-winded, I totally forgot about that. Totally forgot that there was a spy. It wasn't mentioned in between the tales. That was the worst case of foreshadowing I had ever seen, because by page 440 or whatever, there's this huge revelation of who the spy is and this traitor and stuff like that. And all the pilgrims are like, no way. And I'm like, oh shoot, I totally forgot there was a spy, because guess what? You didn't cue me in all those pages. So the foreshadowing was really bad. Maybe there was like one comment every 300 pages. Maybe I missed it, but I had my mind set on other stuff like the short stories. So foreshadowing was terrible. There was supposed to be this huge revelation among the pilgrims, and then I'm like, I forgot about it. Sorry. It's not a revelation to me because I totally forgot about it. So that's it. So one final thing about the structure. I think this could work. A lot of people praised Hyperion for this. Part of their praises were like, this book is for everyone, like, because it works with different genres. Every tale is written differently. Like the first tale is kind of like a journal of like kind of the like a missionary's journal. It's an exiled priest specifically, but it's kind of a horror, like kind of involving this what would look like androgynous people, but the backstory of these people, really scary. It's a scary, scary story. It unnerved me a lot, in a good way. I didn't know I could take horror, but I guess I can. I don't want to watch it though. Very scary. What was my point? Oh, it works like a journal, and then the soldier's tale is very high action military. It was a little too much for me. I as soon as they were working with action and weapons, I was like, let me get to the moment of the Shrike. The third tale, more or less, kind of this pretty profane poet. Maybe people can get a chuckle about his profanities. And it has a tragic ending, like they all have in a different way. The Scholar's Tale was really good. It was a tragedy, but it was really, really, really well written. I cried. It was really good. The Priest, the Priest Tale, the first tale, and then the Scholar's Tale. Priest is kind of this horror, but pretty well written book. Scholar's Tale was probably my favorite. The others were fine. I didn't bother reading the Consul's Tale because at that point it was just too long. So I can't give it a rating. But one was a detective, like a hard boiled noir detective involving AI and like cybrids, AI who have the human DNA and stuff like that. I'm like, that's interesting. So I feel like I'm missing another one. But each tale is written in a different genre. So people say, well, if you don't like this, you might like that. And I'm like, I think people can go between different genres if it's well written. I didn't mind the different writing styles. It just wasn't paced well. Like it could have been a lot more succinct, even if the voices of these different people are very distinct, are very different. It was just keep it short. Now this is a rant, guys. So in no way should you judge my long-winded review of this long-winded book. I'm not writing I am writing a book, but it's gonna be highly edited and stuff like that. What else? I did mention, so we talked about structure, pacing, and characters. This will be short. There was a diverse cast of characters with just different backgrounds, planetary backgrounds, even backgrounds involving time. Some come from like this pre-era before space travel, um, and so you have a very interesting cast. I want to mention one thing, and maybe readers didn't mind this, or maybe they thought what I don't think, but basically, the Pilgrims, Dan Simmons wanted us to believe that there's this camaraderie between all these people, these 7 people. I didn't get that at all. Like, they were more or less complete strangers the whole time, even after telling their tale. There are a couple moments where there's this kind of shared camaraderie, like they're cheering on someone trying to jump aboard this, moving um, train car in the sky. It's a cool scene, but everything seemed really off. Like they were complete strangers, or maybe they were mad at it, like they didn't trust one person. None of them really should have trusted each other because I think the spy was general knowledge. I can't remember, to be honest, but they were complete strangers with completely different stories. And so I didn't see any growth or actually well developed empathy and sympathy toward any of them, maybe except the scholar with his newborn, his infant child. But I didn't get it. Like I didn't get it. A couple other things. This and I promise we'll get into the chat. This book, I wanted to talk that. Let's see. I didn't know going into this book about some other content. It is highly graphic in terms of violence and sex. The violence, I don't think I could see on film. I wasn't squeamish, but there was a lot of grotesque graphic violence, especially involving the Shrike. Um, and it kind of in conjunction with the graphic sex, it kind of gave me a really heavy impression that this writer really wanted to write this kind of stuff, this kind of erotica, violent, hyper violent genre. And so it's not like a strict sci-fi. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of that kind of content with sci-fi anyway, but this was over the top. A lot of it was cringe. A lot of it was like some of it's really messed up. And the thing is, it was so messed up. I wanted to know why the Shrike in particular caused such profanity. Like there were times where each character involved in the tales knew they were hyper. This was Vice on a hyper scale, and I was like, does that have to do with the Shrike? And I was kind of setting myself up with that expectation. It's like because every time the Shrike appears, something really graphic and really sinful and really gross is happening. And I'm like, maybe it's the Shrike working with their psychology on that. And it was never explored. There were a lot of things in the book that was like, okay, maybe it's this, and then it's never explored. And so when I was reading reviews after having read the book, a lot of people were thinking, you know what, I think this is just the author really getting off on this kind of uber hyper graphic content. So it's not really for the faint of heart. Had I known there was a lot of graphic violence and sex, probably I was mad at the book anyway, so it wasn't even worth seeing all that in the book. But I know people the mileage may vary with that. As a Christian, I don't really recommend it for that content. Now on religion, this is my final point before getting into the chat. On religion, there is at first I thought it was, I couldn't tell. Let's just say it was very ambiguous as far as where Dan Simmons was going as far as the Catholic Church. And I'm not Catholic, by the way. I mean, I'm marrying a Catholic, but I have high respect for the Catholic faith. It's not unlike my Protestant faith. I know people say, no, they're different. There are a lot of similarities too. But at the very least, even if it's something I don't share in, at least have some understanding of and at least reverence toward. I had read that maybe Dan Simmons had grown up Catholic, but and it gets worse with subsequent books, so I'm so glad I'm not reading it, but he was working out the Catholic faith kind of on the premise of how much time and space travel could affect such a church. And it gets to be very political and militant, and a lot of people have that speculation of the faith anyway, so it's not surprising that that would be, um, looked at, with sci-fi especially, but it is hyper levels of mockery. Even with the probably a little bit with the Islamic faith too, there's a little bit of, mockery there, but not on the level that the Catholic faith receives. The it's based on very gross context that I think is more of a misunderstanding of faith. It's not even like a parody. Like, it is called the Catholic Church in the story, and there are some things that are blasphemous. So it's really not for the Christian. The sci-fi book is not for the Christian reader. Um, but more than that, it's this mockery is based on something. It tells me that he has very limited understanding of the faith. There's this one, I remember in particular involves a mental interior debate. I think I have a gift from my wonderful Catholic fiance. Let's see. Oh, okay. I haven't read the chat, so I haven't seen the action involving the chat. I'll get to the chat in just a second. Um, that's kind of funny. Anyway, but the mockery of the Catholic faith, and even the Jewish faith, like the Judaism at one point with this Jewish scholar, it really told me that's like you you're trying to sound like you can argue against the Christian faith or Judaism or whatever. It sounds like you're trying to have a very effective argument against the religion without having the theological understanding of the religion itself. And so if you want to do an antithetical representation of any religion, doesn't matter what religion it is, you have to understand the nature of the religion, meaning you have to understand, in this case, the nature of God involving the Catholic faith. So if the writer was really, I couldn't tell what his motives were involving the Catholic faith. It was like these, like, okay, let's just say this. The Catholic faith in this story is a blasphemous version of the actual faith in our reality. People can debate me on that, whatever. This is my channel. I'm not even Catholic, okay? So there's no real point in debating me anyway. But uh he was trying to make these arguments on morality without understanding the moral nature of God himself. And it came across incredibly shallow, like really shallow stuff that theologians have debated for centuries, and it's like, oh, I have this argument. It's like, you actually don't have an argument. And there was a lot of, I wanted the Shrike to, okay, I promise I will get into the this is a long stream, forgive me. I promise I'll get into the chat. I wanted so badly the Shrike to be the embodiment of the antithesis of God in this respect, because twice in the book, the Shrike happens. He appears when the person is understanding the absolute evil nature of himself. Like two different characters that happen. Like, oh, the Shrike needs to be the embodiment of some sort of, religious antithesis. And so I thought what was a very terrifying symbol of the crucifix, I thought, oh, that's like just this parasitic entity that is mocking the Catholic faith. But then when I see that the Catholic faith itself is becoming very abhorrent and political and malicious, I'm like, oh, okay. This has nothing to do with the Shrike. This has nothing to do with it's it's twisting its psychology on the people. Like, the priests aren't innocent. It's like, say what you want, like, about scandals and stuff like that, but it's well, this came in the 80s too, like getting into the 90s. So I was like, okay, I am not endorsing writing a mockery of any religion, no matter what religion it is. But if any writer wants to endeavor to do that, you've got to know the theology about it, and that's all I's got to say because it's a very cheap argumentation. Like, oh, I did it. I, you know, I'm okay. Let's just say that the person wanted to invalidate the nature of God without understanding the nature of God. That's all I want to say. So that is all I have to say about Hyperion. World building, awesome, but it was poorly executed, and so yeah. Anyway, that is Hyperion. I hope I made sense. So let's go ahead and go through the chat. Oh my gosh, 7:30. Lots of stuff. Lots of stuff. I see Wolfton. Nice to see you, man. So let me turn off the camera real quick. It's warm. So it's like even the not the AC, but the dehumidifier's on. And I just feel like it's hot. So let's see. So good to see you, Wolf10. Photos and stuff is here. Welcome. Excuse me. You say Asimov was talented in making his stories feel human and in layman's terms. Yeah. And a lot of people criticize Dan Simmons for his gobbledygook with terminology. I wasn't too put off by that because I knew I would see it later, but some people did have a problem with that. Brian Gilmartin says, the stories really don't respect the reader's time and don't bother to build up their wham moments. Okay, so on that, I felt like my time was really disrespected. You don't want to do that to a reader. I know there's control of the author saying, well, I want to write what I want to write. I'm like, that's fine. But if you, like, for instance, chances are like probably 90% of your readers for Hyperion are very much interested in what happens to the 7 pilgrims, not even what happens to the galactic affairs between the AI and the hegemony. Interesting concept, but if that's not the central plot of the first book, don't make it like more a part of the second book. One book review. I was going to talk about book reviews today, but this was a really long stream. I'll talk about it a second stream. One book review, he loved the first book, but he was really disappointed with the second book because he really wanted to see what was happening to the 7 pilgrims in the second book. Now according to him, we do get to see that as a reader, but through the perspective of a completely new character. And you see glimpses of what happens to the original pilgrims while you're working on the galactic scale of something else. That, to me, I can imagine that frustrating a lot of people. Like, I followed these 7 characters. Can I just see what happens to them? And then you can move on to your stuff. So I think the whole structure was like, I would do such a poorly structured book almost out of laziness and spite. I'm not saying Dan Simmons is a spiteful writer, but like, why? How can you not know that that's what the one thing your audience would want for the second book? Like, you left me on a cliffhanger to follow these 7 characters or 6 characters or whatever, and now I'm not going to be satisfied. So I was kind of surprised when I heard that from the book review. I was like, you're not respecting. You're not respecting the reader's time, and then you're also not respecting the reader's emotional investment, and that's a bad move as far as a writer is concerned. Brian says, I gotta say, Sound Engravers rants are probably the most low key I've ever heard. Oh, thank you. Sometimes like I feel like I can be really cheeky, and I don't mean to be malicious, but sometimes I wonder if I could come across that way. Certainly more than me, I'd be yelling and swearing up a storm. Andreas Hernandez says, even though you don't have the impact of Darth Vader being Luke's father, A New Hope by itself is a good movie. Yeah, it's a conclusion. Yeah, exactly. And it was supposed to be its own thing anyway. Oh yeah, that. Let's see, what time is it? Man, okay. We gotta make time for this. Well, again, keep that in mind, Andreas Hernandez, for the next stream because um, a lot of people these days don't for film, for books, for TV shows or whatever, or seasons, separate seasons. They don't have self-contained TV shows. I'm just gonna say right off the bat, like the whole Ahsoka show coming for Star Wars, I don't think it's gonna have. I think it's gonna have an uptick of viewership, like maybe the first one or two episodes, and then I think it's gonna drop a lot. And here's the reason: normies don't know who Ahsoka is, and even more, normies would have to see two shows to get the context of what's happening in the Ahsoka show. I can't remember. It's for San Diego Comic-Con, but I was going through like the T-Mobile list of articles and stuff like that or whatever. I don't know, like just a separate homepage where you could just see the news or whatever. And then I see, oh, our dear friend Ashley Eckstein has something to say about the live action Ahsoka show. Let's see what she has to say. And it was a really short article, which is great. But basically, she's like, this is going to be amazing. Yes, yes, watch it. But before you watch it, it's going to come out next month. Before you watch it, you have to watch the Clone Wars and Rebels to get the context. I never saw Rebels, but I did see the Clone Wars. And that is hours of commitment to understand the context of the Ahsoka show. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if you have to have that background information locked in. But if that is the premise of that show or any other show, that is bad. That's bad because a lot of people are like, I just want a self-contained show. I want to go into a show not needing any background, any exposition. Just give me action. Give me a plot. Give me some suspense. Give me some dialogue, and give me action. A lot of people, understandably, do not have the time and attention and emotional investment to do all this prep work, all this homework before watching a show. And same is true for novels. It's like, what Dan Simmons should have done was a string of short stories, short tales, and then us being introduced to the characters in real time. That would have made much more sense. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. Wolf 10 says, if you have to have overarching stories, or overarching? Yeah. Stories, you best refine your storytelling. I mean, it could be done, but Asimov did it pretty well. Even though his prose and his narrative is more or less outdated now, he still did it effectively. So, Gigawatt says sci-fi has always had a problem with referencing current day music in the way, way off future. That's interesting. Yeah, I mean something like the first Guardians of the Galaxy movie that made sense. You're exploring the galaxy, but it's in real time with Quill. Is that his last name? With his life. So yeah, but again, I have to belabor this point if I have to. Wizard of Oz in the year 2800. I mean, it's a classic, but I just doubt that people would instantly know that song. In fact, I'll ask some of my little kid music students if they know the song, and if they don't, Simmons dropped the ball. Photo says, when Essie finishes writing her own book, it becomes an audio book. I'd love to be a voice actor for it. Also, love to score it, but she's a composer too. Well, thank you. Appreciate that. I already have themes for my characters, so the score will probably be taken care of. Audible book would be cool, but I'll just be happy that I finally published this stuff. Final Fantasy fan says, want a huge story that is a sci-fi, horror, fantasy, and western, and has a gripping narrative. Go read Vampire Hunter D. or at least watch both the animated films. I'm not into horror. Um, there was some horror I could take with this book, but I have a threshold, and I can't see horror, so I can't see it as a visual thing. Conceptually, I can stomach horror if it's again, it's gotta be well done, well done. If it's not well done, if it's just kinda sensationalized, I don't like it. Hello, Enrique, uh, Cabrera. Sorry you're late. What are we talking about? Well, I just finished an hour of ranting, so ranting about Hyperion. Yeah, next week I'm gonna talk we don't have time tonight, but next week I'm gonna talk about book reviews themselves. Because I learned a lot about looking at book reviews of this book in particular. Very interesting. Wolf10 says, sounds like some trash story telling telling that it is too self-aware of how trashy it is. I don't There was some really disturbing imagery. Let's just say that. I don't even want to say it publicly. I told the prof last night, and he's like, "Ooh." So like, if I got that reaction out of him, I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna. It's not appropriate to say publicly. Um. All right, Cypher, welcome. Is that all the chat? Oh no, the chat jumped, I think. Oh. Fotis and stuff says, I'm not religious, but when religion is depicted well on the mainstream media, I enjoy it. The symbolism and religious overtones of the DC comic Kingdom Come actually moved me. I don't know anything about that, and I don't know if that's endorsed by Professor Geek. Someone, I think it was David Stewart, talking about the games Diablo. I don't know anything about those games. I won't ever play those games, but he was kind of not really complaining, but he was more or less expressing how the view of hell and purgatory and different things like that is very off. It's not a Christian, that they're kind of placing it as like a Christian theological thing, but it's more of a faction, maybe an offshoot of a religion that believes this much about hell and purgatory and stuff like that. And one of his viewers was saying that the church, and I don't know all the literature, I don't know all the video games and movies, but the person on his chat was complaining that something like the Catholic Church, if it's used not even allegorically, if it's used specifically, like literally, it's hardly used for as a force of good. And whatever people, that's the thing, is like people have a, just a variety of views and misunderstandings of something like the Catholic Church, and a lot of unwarranted prejudices of the Catholic Church. Again, I'm saying this not as a Catholic, but it's like, oh, come on, people can be a little bit more intellectually honest than that, and sometimes it's not. And the thing is, again, I'm just going to say this: if you're going to depict a religion, especially a real life religion, but even just a fictional, structural religion in your fiction, your stories, then understand the theology. That's the most intellectually honest thing a person can do. When people base a religion off of stereotypes and prejudices that aren't warranted, and say, "Well, no, that's how they believe things like heaven and hell and stuff." It's like, well, no, that's that's from presumption and like the it's like the game telephone. It's like that you start with the actual thing and then like going around 8 or 9 people, and it's like, that's not what I said it was. So, anyway. Cypher says, no one will watch Ahsoka except for very hardcore fans, in my opinion. I will say, I do think the community of hardcore fans involving something like Star Wars. I don't know why I thought of Star Fox. It is dwindling. It's yeah, it's dwindling a lot. I don't Yeah, I mean, even people who love the movies, like the Star Wars movies, a lot of people didn't watch the Clone Wars because they're not interested in the animation. So my friend Big Al saying he watches it doesn't make sense because he didn't watch the animation. So it could be. I don't think it's just gonna like. I think if Kenobi didn't do it, I think Mandalorian season 3 really did it. I think Mandalorian season 3 really, really upset a lot of people. Like any fire, any embers, I should say, is the thing. Time is going to really extinguish the fuel underneath the fire. The fire is going to be put out pretty soon. Here's since we mentioned it, even though I brought it up first. 1 second. Here's my prediction for the Ahsoka show. It's going to be terribly written. That's a fact. Because people who swear up and down that Dave Filoni is the bestest creative ever don't realize just how awful a writer he is. He's a terrible writer. I've said it for years. You who've been on my streams all these years, seen my videos on Star Wars, I've been saying for years that Filoni can't write, or he writes very poorly. Now, no one saw that. No fan seemed to understand how terrible the Siege of Mandalore was except me. But people are going to see just how terrible the writing of Ahsoka will be. Because first of all, we have had all this time, between the Siege of Mandalore and now. That's a good 4 years, right? Few years at least. We've had terrible shows from Star Wars and also from Marvel. So Lucasfilm, Disney, between shows and movies, the writing has tanked. 3 to 4 years of that happening already. So my prediction is going to be right. It's going to be a terribly written show. Ahsoka, she might have her faults and her failures because people at least know, like, well, we can't make her like Rey because she's not a Mary Sue, so she has to have these artificial failures, like, because they were artificial in the Clone Wars. I've mentioned that a lot of times. So they're gonna kind of put the facade of failure and the facade of self-doubt and stuff like that, but she's pretty much gonna be capable of everything. Maybe she will fail, but my prediction is someone like Thrawn, he's going to be a total dolt because they made someone like Cad Bane a dolt. So Thrawn's not going to get the right treatment. He's going to be terrible. And he's not even my favorite villain. Prof knows this. but I'll say, okay, fine. Thrawn, while I don't prefer him as a villain, he still had fortitude, and that fortitude was intellect. He's going to have no intellect. He's not going to have any intellectual capacity because there's going to be stupid mistakes. There are going to be blunders involving him and stuff like that. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Here's what I'm not going to be wrong about. People in whatever context, they're going to see, oh, that writing's bad. Oh, Ahsoka's not as likable as she was in the animated series. Why is that? Kathleen Kennedy! She got a hold of Ahsoka! Our beloved Ahsoka! Dave Filoni, where are you? That's going to happen. People are going to actually see, they didn't see it with the Siege of Mandalore, but they actually are going to see the terrible writing involving this show. Things are not going to make sense. Like they didn't make sense and things didn't add up with Mandalorian. You know, how things kind of just like, oh. And Jon Favreau said he's like, oh, no. He wasn't supposed to leave. I gave you clues, guys. He wasn't supposed to lead Mandalore. I read that in an article that Jon Favreau came forward and said, no, we gave you this little clue right here in season 2. He wasn't ever supposed to lead. And people got mad about that. It's going to be the same with Ahsoka. People are going to see, like, what happened to Ahsoka? She was the greatest character ever. She was one of the best characters in Star Wars. And they ruined her. They sullied her. Now, whether Kathleen Kennedy is part of it, I don't know. She could be, but she's not the only reason. And I suspect, I could be wrong, she might not be a part of this show. It's all going to be the terrible writing of Dave Filoni or his team, his yes people. He's gonna have just writers say, "Oh no, that's fine. Everyone loves Ahsoka. You can't go wrong. You can do no wrong with Ahsoka." And then he's done his thing. He's gonna make her great. People are gonna see how off it is because it's been years of terrible writing with Disney, years of terrible writing with Star Wars involving Ahsoka. People didn't see it until now. And to that I say, I told you so. That's all I have to say. Anyway. So let's see. Now we're talking about Star Wars, but it's almost 8 o'clock. Let's see. Cypher says, I don't care anymore. The problem lies in Disney storytelling. Nothing matters. They retcon the beginning of Baby Yoda's arc. They change everything. They change everything. Now I mean, I never watched it, but on some level, I understood the appeal with season 1. This guy was a loner. He became a kind of like he was for himself. Then he became a father figure, adoptive father figure. And then I had understood from the general populace watching this stuff that he was supposed to take on this kind of leadership role with Mandalore. And guess who usurped him? A woman. Worse than that, a terrible woman. I always disliked Bo-Katan. I always disapproved of her character. She was no hero. So, I mean, Ahsoka might not be that atrocious as far as like replacing characters or whatever, or deconstructing characters. She, you know, the show itself might not be that horrendous, but things aren't going to make sense, and people are going to be going like, what happened? All right. Andreas Hernandez says, people are coming around and realizing Dave Filoni isn't that great, huh? Finally. But I'm glad it's happening. I'm just glad. That's all. I hear it from the people who watch Disney Star Wars. All power to them who think along those lines and still watch Star Wars. Well, I mean, Big L, to be fair, like, how do you think about these things about the sequel trilogy and still like the Disney stuff? It's like it's still the same incongruence story-wise. So this is an important point. And this goes back to Dan Simmons, guys. This all in full circle right here. Right here. No, right here. There we go. In fairness, Din Djarin didn't want to lead. So the motive of the character in this case does not matter because now you have set up viewers' expectations that he will lead. Now, maybe he didn't want to lead as a character, and then he assumes the role and then passes on the mantle after his rightful place as king. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. But here's the thing. You know, I won't debate Big Al here because I know where he stands on these things. But just in general, the consensus was he's supposed to handle the dark saber, and he has presence, so he's going to be a leader of some kind, at least established with the first 2 seasons, just based on his characterization. That was the thought of every audience member, every viewer. People are thinking, okay, it's going to lead to something. And then people are kind of saying, well, yeah, he's this adoptive father now to Yoda. Maybe he'll train him to be a Mandalorian or whatever. And maybe that happens. I don't know. Maybe that expectation is met. But a lot of people were very, very, very ticked off. They were so mad that Bo-Katan usurped that position. That's how I felt with Hyperion. Now, by the way, guys, consume stories responsibly. I went into Hyperion thinking I would like it because it's a classic sci-fi book. I thought, this is interesting, some premise. Okay, let's give it a go. And then I left the book totally mad, not expecting I would hate it. I don't hate it. I just really don't like it. But I didn't go into the book thinking I was going to dislike it and disapprove of it. So, like, yeah, I'm gonna be a little bit better now, of what I read, 'cause when I don't care for something, I just need to leave the book. I'm a little bit of a completionist, at least for the first book. I'm like, "Nah, I didn't even need to finish the first book." So consume stories responsibly. But, if you're a writer of a TV show or a graphic novel or just a standard novel or even a short story, and you're setting up expectations, you need to meet those expectations within the book, within the confines of the medium, or in a very short series. People were really not happy with Mandalorian season 3 because the expectations were not only not met, they were actually disintegrated. And that was the Last Jedi effect. So Mandalorian season 3 should really have the same bad effect as The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker in terms of expectations not being met. I'm not even talking about subversion of expectations. I'm just talking about simple, like, if you subvert expectations, the reader can say, "Oh, I was not expecting that at all, but now I see why." That's the whole premise of a good mystery. Like, the mystery is about, like, oh, the final blow is like, "Oh, I should have seen that coming the whole time, but all these things were pointing me in this direction." That's a good subversion of expectations. But whether the character wants to be a leader or not, like, it's kinda like saying Aragorn. Let's say Peter Jackson really hammed up the reluctant hero with Aragorn saying, "I don't wanna be a king, I don't wanna be a king." And then people are expecting he's going to not just lead the charge in the war, but then end up being king. And then let's say Peter Jackson said, "No, he really doesn't wanna be a king, guys. He's gonna establish Faramir as a king." What would be what would have been the reaction to that? People would have been ticked. So anyway, it's 8 o'clock. I should probably get going. Oh, I'm so glad to get all this stuff off my chest. I still want to talk about book reviews at another time, but that will be for another stream. I have a topic for my stream next video. Well, let's go ahead and see the chat a few minutes more. Cypher says you can subvert expectations when you're doing it for story. What is the story of The Mandalorian? What is the show about now? I don't know, because I didn't watch it. I just knew a lot of people were mad. So, yeah, Brian's right. Time flies when you're ranting. So that's what I'm going to say about the whole Star Wars thing. Besides reading the EU, I just haven't really been paying attention to Star Wars. Like, months go by and I'm like, "Oh, what's happening?" And then I'll see an article like what I saw a couple of weeks back, or a few days back with Ashley Eckstein saying, "Oh, no, this show is not self-contained. You need to watch the Clone Wars. You need to watch Rebels." It's like, that's a huge commitment you're asking just for watching the show. So, no, you don't need to commit. That's actually one last little tiny thing before we wrap it up. Writers, I would say definitely practice writing self-contained stories, whether it's a short story or even the first book of a series. The first book of the series, the first movie of the trilogy, whatever it is, it has to be a closure, a very satisfying closure before getting into the next installment. It doesn't, and it could be a cliffhanger, and it could be a well done cliffhanger, but even so, it has to be a very good closure. Like, you can't end a book right in the middle of a dialogue and say, "What happened?" And then, like, in book 2, you won't finish the dialogue until, like, chapter 3. That was like Dan Simmons, okay? So anyway, that's why, as a conclusion, that's why I give Hyperion a 1.5 stars, maybe even a 1 star out of 5. People say if you're very serious about reading science fiction for the first time, you should read Hyperion. I do not say that, maybe I'll do a video on recommendations. My first thought, if you really want to get into science fiction, like really good science fiction, I know this is a given. This is probably the most obvious answer in the whole world, but I stand by it. If you want to get into science fiction, 1984. That was the first book I wrote. That was the first sci-fi book I read, and I pretty much have that kind of level of expectations for all sci-fi literature because of that. So anyway, last thing I'll say is just because of working a few different jobs and then preparing for the wedding, for my YouTube channel, I'm not breaking away from my YouTube channel, but I'm really only going to be streaming. The creative time that I do have, I just really want to compose and work in SuperCollider and write my story. I need my creative time, and unfortunately, that takes precedence over doing content for YouTube. Now, I'll do things like ambient music, music for concentration, music for sleep and focus. I'm messing with sound generators, and I'm doing ambient stuff, and I'll eventually release it as an album. That kind of stuff I'm already working on, and then I can produce pretty quickly for YouTube. The next video I'm gonna do is it's gonna be like the brown noise that you saw, but it's pink noise, and it's gonna sound. I made it sound like you're inside a spaceship. So it's pretty cool. I like it anyway. So I'll do that kind of video for a little bit, and then I might chop up some stuff for my streams. But just because how things are really kind of picking up the pace before Professor Geek and I get married, it'll be a little on the low side. And then hopefully 2024, I'll get back into things like SuperCollider tutorials and Logic and music and stuff like that. So I'll still be streaming, but I have eczema. That's gross. I'll still be streaming, but as far as music experimentation videos and commentary, it's going to be a little on the down low until after I get married. So anyway, yeah, Sound Engraver rants about Star Wars despite talking about something else. Yeah, I know. I need to go. I just need to talk about science fiction, not Star Wars. Disney needs to just stop making Star Wars. That's all. Anyway, I'll end it with that. So I really just appreciate you guys for tuning in. That was fun. I know that's a big risk talking about how bad Hyperion is, because it is a beloved. People really do like this book, so they might get really mad. I might get a lot of downvotes for this stream, but all in all, I think it is a very overhyped mess. It's an old book, but it's very famous. I mean, apparently not as famous as I thought it was, but the praise and the hype about this book, there were a couple good things, but there are a lot of bad things. And I do not recommend Hyperion as a sci-fi read, especially if you're first starting out with sci-fi. So anyway, take it easy, everyone. Thanks for joining, and I will see you next time. Bye.